well, Mr. Stephen Gray with the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. And today we have a very special guest. We have Laurel Sugden.
Hello.
Now, Laurel is a doctoral student and a USONA Institute scholar in interdisciplinary studies. She's supervised by Wade Davis and Zachary Walsh at the University of British Columbia. So she's right here in BC. She was born and raised in the enchanted Flathead watershed of Montana. She grew up with an appreciation for the medicine plants of the Rocky Mountains. She's also traveled throughout Latin America and spent 4 months studying with the San Pedro curanderos in the Peruvian Andes. Her research interests center on Andean culture, history, psychedelic therapy, and facilitating cross-disciplinary and multi-generational conversations that imagine the future of plant medicine as globalized society. She is in love with barefoot hikes, meditation, and cold water swimming. So she's probably a fan of Wim Hof. Welcome, Laurel.
Thank you, Mark.
Now, before we get started, or as we get started, maybe you can tell everybody who's watching and who will be watching, maybe a little bit about your story and how you got interested, in this work, and specifically into the San Pedro cactus and what you did down there in Latin America.
Certainly, yeah. So I first came across the San Pedro cactus in 2017, and really it was about 2 years ago now. I was just wrapping up my degree at university, my undergrad, which was quite stressful, and my long-term relationship was falling apart, and Donald Trump had just been elected president of the United States of America. So I bought a plane ticket to Peru like that. And I was intending to go to hike and surf, and I did quite a bit of that. But really, I got to the Andes and I found myself just immersed in this whole new world. A place where the land is really alive, and people recognize that they are part of their environment rather than separate from it. And,
just to interrupt for a second, was that, where was that? Like up around Lake Titicaca, that high Andes area up that way?
Yeah, so I was in Titicaca at some points, but I did most of my wandering in the Andes around Cordillera Blanca, around Huaraz, and around Chavín de Huántar, as well as southeast of Cusco in the Cordillera Vilcanota. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Yeah. So I really didn't have any intention of ingesting any hallucinogenic brews, but very serendipitously, I ended up taking San Pedro, and I remember sort of going into it thinking, I wonder if this could change my life. Probably not. And 24 hours later, of course, I was just prostrate with awe. Wow. And knew that this is something I had to pursue. So
was this in a circle, like a ceremonial circle?
It was, yeah. And so I first took San Pedro in the Sacred Valley outside of Cusco, where there are quite a few circles working with San Pedro.
So what happened that night?
San Pedro, I think, is a really unique medicine in that it's very, very heart-opening. And that would sort of be the defining characteristic that I would describe of this medicine, is just, it works with our hearts, not our heads. And it doesn't blast us into outer space. It takes us more deeply into the fabric of this world. And so, I realized, just personally, that there was this, I'd always had sort of, me in here and the world out there, and there was like a cloudy veil in between me and the world, and that disappeared.
Wow, beautiful. That's the way 99.9% of humans live all the time, right? With that veil in the way. Yeah. Have you taken peyote before?
I haven't, and I would be fascinated to learn from peyote.
Yeah, I just wondered because if I'm not mistaken, it's the same psychoactive alkaloid mescaline, right? As in San Pedro. Yeah.
It is, yeah. So,
And Peruvian torch, I
I
understand,
think
right?
San Pedro has about a third of the concentration of mescaline that peyote does, but it's much, much bigger. So you end up consuming more cactus, about 1.5 feet of columnar cactus for a dose.
And how
And
do you
it's also
prepare it?
more
Oh,
pure mescaline.
oh. So how do you prepare it for consumption?
Yeah, so the cactus is generally chopped very finely and then boiled in water, and the solids are strained out and kind of squeezed. Mescaline is so water soluble that you don't need there are no complicated extraction methods.
Mhm.
And in Peru, they'll sometimes add admixture plants. In northern Peru, sometimes they'll add datura. Um,
Mm,
but in general, it's just the cactus. So
mhm.
every sort of curandero, that every healer who works with the plant sort of has their own preparation secrets that they don't share too much with anybody else, even their apprentices usually.
Does it often
So
induce purging the way peyote can?
yeah, it does, and that depends also on the way the cactus is prepared. So sometimes, usually if there's purging, it'll happen within the first couple hours. There's this sort of initial cleansing phase that people feel the plant is searching through their body, looking for blockages and sort of cleaning. And if there's a lot of cleaning that needs to be done, then people will often purge.
Mhm.
So sometimes curanderos, sometimes healers will prepare specific concoctions to induce vomiting, like just cooking the spines, for example, will produce something that will, make you vomit.
Mm.
Often they'll use insufflated tobacco to induce vomiting
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah. Um, you you've compared it in some ways to other psychedelics or contrasted it. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I guess for one, there's the heart opening quality, and mescaline structurally, it's a phenethylamine, which is distinct from the tryptamine components found in ayahuasca and mushrooms, for example.
Mm.
So a phenethylamine, mescaline, is actually closer in structure to MDMA or ecstasy than it is to the other
Mm.
hallucinogens.
Interesting.
Um, so
Yeah,
it's
interesting. I was involved with the Native American Church quite a lot for about a dozen years with the peyote medicine, and the first time I took MDMA, I felt that it was similar to peyote but harsher in a sense. You know that like peyote, apart from the fact that you're up all night, doesn't tend to deplete you. In fact, it can often leave you in a kind of a really nice after state for 3 or 4 days afterwards. Whereas my experience, and I think it's common with MDMA, is that it really depletes you for a couple of days afterwards. So to me, it was like peyote felt like a more natural and perhaps healthier, but similar version of something like MDMA.
Yeah, and that's something that people often feel with San Pedro as well, that, they might be a little tired right after ceremony, but in the following days, they feel incredibly energetic and uplifted.
Hmm. Yeah. Have you done it
So,
a lot since?
sorry, what?
Have you done it a lot since that first encounter?
Yeah, so I studied with my teacher in for about 2 weeks after that first encounter, and then I returned. I was in Peru and Ecuador actually from March through July this year, studying San Pedro, and part of that was working with it myself, and part of it was is studying the cultural history behind San Pedro over the last several thousand years.
So tell us more about, you as an anthropologist, about the cultural history of San Pedro.
I am sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Can you speak just a little more loudly?
Sure. I'm just curious, as an anthropologist yourself, just to speak more about that cultural history of San Pedro and what it's used for and how they honor the plant.
Yeah, absolutely. So we first really have archaeological evidence that San Pedro was used 4,000 years ago, which is just incredible. We kind of looking at the history of the Andes themselves, people migrated there first about 15,000 years ago. And they sort of were in these isolated nomadic hunting gathering tribes that, sort of warred between each other and moved throughout the Andes. And then, they sort of settled down and maybe migrated seasonally, but something really inexplicable happened about 4,000 years ago. Going from these cultures who really didn't produce a lot of art, didn't have any kind of ceramic tradition, we're really just dabbling in agriculture. All of a sudden, there was this incredible fluorescence, really, of art and culture and sophistication that could, be compared to the Renaissance that happened in Europe thousands of years later, but I would argue is even more profound. So all of a sudden, starting about 4,000 years ago, we have these very elaborate ceremonial centers popping up. These really sophisticated worldviews and ideas about cosmology and duality. And, that's exactly when San Pedro shows up as well. And so there's this question, which was actually asked first, as far as I know, by Wade Davis in an essay in the 90s. Could San Pedro have had any responsibility for this sudden and inexplicable birth of culture, which subsequently disseminated to all of the Andes and is responsible for all of the Andean culture that is so rich that exists today. So, kind of the way that people have been looking at this culture, which was Chavin, was this great empire that was built, is that they're like, well, what's going on here, and making very detailed observations about archaeology, ceremonial space, but I don't think anybody who's studying this culture is really taking San Pedro and fully recognizing the power of the plant in relation to the potential for birthing a culture. So
Fascinating.
that's the question we're asking.
Yeah, wonderful. What have you? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I'm just always curious because there's always so many interesting stories of how, like the shamans discovered combo and ayahuasca and things. Is there a story how these people discovered San Pedro and its properties? Did they stumble upon it? Was it a healing that needed to happen? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, we have no idea because there's no written record. It sort of just shows up. And as far as I know, there aren't really any sort of origin myths that go along with it. San Pedro is often associated with the symbols of the jaguar and the hummingbird. So there's sort of these origin myths about, stories about the hummingbird and how it came to be the messenger of God. We can look at sort of the different names that there are for San Pedro throughout Peru to answer that question. I've worked mostly with varieties called cura, which, is cures, and espina, which means spine. Some varieties are called like pene de Dios, God's penis. So that could say something about origins. And throughout most of the Andes, actually, the native Quechua word for San Pedro is Huachuma, which has traditionally been translated as dizzy, which sort of reinforces this notion that the cactus makes you go crazy and hallucinate and, lose equilibrium. But really, a more accurate translation of Huachuma, uma means head, is decapitated. So, as you know, the Andes have had as you might know, the Andes have had a preoccupation with decapitation for a while. So,
Well, I was thinking about, I was thinking of that metaphor more as, sort of, getting out of your head, and into something bigger and more real in that sense. I wanted to ask you about, you've observed lots of different curanderos or environments where they've worked with this medicine, and wondering how much commonality and how many kinds of differences there have been that you've observed between the way that different curanderos work. I mean, for example, in the peyote religion in the United States, there are variations, but they all have some distinct commonalities. They all have a fire, which is central to the whole thing. They have an altar, which has some variations, but a lot of similarities. And they have prayer songs, which are quite similar, from one place to another. Wondering what you've observed about, commonalities and differences in that world.
Yeah, so really today in Peru, there are a few different ways of working with the plant, but really one that's sort of the biggest, which is the North Coastal tradition centered on the healing cult of North Coastal Peru at Huancabamba. So through that tradition, there is a very defined way of working with San Pedro. They'll use a sort of a main altar cloth, like actually I've got one here. That so it's sort of a woven cloth, and on top are very powerful objects, perhaps artifacts from tombs, bones, stones, wood, crystals. And the mesa is sort of the altar. The mesa is seen as the channel through which energies flow. So these healers will hold nocturnal ceremonies. So at night, usually Tuesday and Friday nights, where participants will come who, from all over Peru and actually all over South America. Not necessarily for psychological healing, but rather often for a spat of bad luck, for marriage issues, for ill health physically, that is seen as having a spiritual cause. So in this, major tradition, it's not the San Pedro that does the healing on the patient. It's the healer who drinks San Pedro that is sort of seen as the one extracting negative forces from the patient's body. So
that's similar to the shamanic tradition with ayahuasca too, in the Amazonian mestizo tradition, I think. But does then the client or patient not take the San Pedro? It's only the shaman, the healer.
Yeah, so sometimes not, sometimes yes. Usually, if in this tradition, if the patient takes San Pedro, they don't take a whole lot of it. So I've heard so many times this, San Pedro no me pega, San Pedro doesn't hit me. That it's not, and really that the root of that is that people are not receiving large enough doses in this tradition. Honestly, I've, had San Pedro that hits me more than any ayahuasca I've had. But people just aren't receiving a large enough dose for the plant to actually work with them. So
yeah. So how do you see it? Oh, sorry. Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
didn't mean to. I didn't mean to interrupt. But I was going to ask you, as long as I have interrupted now, I was going to ask you how you're interested in it as in San Pedro as a therapeutic aid, and wondering how you see it moving out of that world into the larger world. Ayahuasca, for example, has spread its wings, or its serpentine energies around the whole planet at this point, right? So how do you see San Pedro not that well known yet, correct? And then so where is it going now? What's happening?
Right. Yeah, I see that the fact that San Pedro isn't that well known yet gives us an enormous amount of opportunity for sort of guiding how this plant comes to the world. Centered around sustainability and ethics. Um, we can sort of see, distinct from the North Coastal tradition that is so orthodox, we can already see some specific traditions forming in Peru. One is in the Sacred Valley outside of Cusco. People are really using the medicine to connect participants with the land, which is sort of in line with the native ceremonies that happen there without San Pedro as well. In that area, ceremonies, often people will be taken to ancient sites, ancient Inca sites, ruins to connect with the land. There's a tradition kind of being birthed in southern Ecuador right now, where people are using the medicine in traditional sweat lodges called temazcals. In Bolivia, they're starting to use San Pedro in combination with native North American dances in a San Pedro long dance that's kind of becoming a trend. Um,
Mm,
as we seek to create new rituals around San Pedro, they really have to take into account just the length of the journey with the medicine. It's usually about a 12-hour journey. So that's twice as long as mushrooms, at least twice as long as ayahuasca, probably more.
mm, mm, mm,
And so, I can imagine sort of creating ritual that, in the first couple hours, people can be sort of sleepy and cold. So maybe something that gets people moving, perhaps dancing, perhaps a fire in the beginning, and, followed by more internal work in the middle of the ceremony. We can't say yet, but I that's sort of where I see San Pedro going is
mm,
creating new rituals that are grounded in the roots of Andean cultural history, but that are relevant for our
mm.
time.
Tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me sustainability won't be that much of a problem because it's really easy to grow, is it not? I mean, people have it all over the place, even up here in pots and things like that.
Well,
Yeah, it's very satisfying to
Yeah.
grow. You can just about buy it at Home Depot. It's perfectly legal, and they're really wonderful to have around. And you're absolutely right, Stephen, that with maybe the exception of mushrooms, I don't think there is a more fast-growing entheogen that I know
Mhm.
about. Um, Ayahuasca is, of course, facing enormous sustainability problems. So is peyote, but San Pedro can grow a foot a year, a foot and a half a year, if it has
Mhm.
enough light. So, really one of the projects I'm working on right now, along with some people in Ecuador who work with San Pedro, is creating a San Pedro sustainability movement where people plant large amounts of San Pedro, and I think that's the best thing we can do right now. Is regardless of whether we're using it to grow it as much as possible. And
Mhm.
it's in Peru, the first thing anybody will tell you about San Pedro is like, oh yeah, I've got it outside my door. It's a guardian, and
Mhm.
and that's what you'll find all over the place. It's always planted at the entryway to houses because it's seen as, deflecting bad energy. It's also said that, if the house is empty and intruders come, that it will make this loud whistling sound and scare away the intruders. That kind of thing. So
that sounds like a good alarm system. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we need to explore, or ask you to explore a little bit more about how you see it moving into the wider world. How do we need to get trained curanderos up in North America and Europe and so on? And also, as part of that question, as it expands, and maybe even now in Peru, are you noticing any corruption, like charlatans or anything capitalizing on the possibility of making money from tourists and so on?
certainly, yeah. Yeah. So I guess as far as your first question goes, I, there has never been a psychological study published on San Pedro. And so, that's one of our goals, along with, Zachary Walsh. We're going to be hopefully, carrying out and publishing the first psychological studies of San Pedro. The process between that and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials is so long that what I would really love to see is that, it can sort of slip in under the radar along with peyote. So, maybe the government sees that, peyote is a sacrament and it becomes legalized for ceremonial use, and maybe San Pedro as another mescaline cactus can slip in there as well. And that's what I would love to see happen. I see that it would be, it's more useful in a ceremonial context than I believe it would be for a therapeutic session like in a doctor's office. Because, for a guide to, a psychiatrist or somebody to be with a patient for 12 or 15 hours during the length of the journey, you'd have to have 2 shifts, and that's tough. As same for clinical trials, that's 2 shifts.
Yeah, and too expensive too.
Too expensive, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So again, no, I was just going to say, still pursuing that line of questioning. My impression is that with the peyote world, for example, and perhaps with the ayahuasca world, the traditional peoples that have worked with these understand them in a way that's even hard to explicate, really. They have a connection to the spirit of the songs. They know why the fire is there. They know why the altar is there. And oftentimes they'll even say they've been taught these things by the spirits, right? So how are we going to bridge that? I mean, how are we going to, keep that connection alive and learn from those deep, deep, wise traditions as we spread this medicine out?
Yeah, so that's a tough one with San Pedro because truly we don't know that there is any living remnant of traditional San Pedro practices that still exists. This North Coastal tradition, sort of the orthodox way of working with San Pedro right now, is, really resembles the structure of Catholicism. It's very heavily rooted in Catholic ideas. Even the shaman to the patient relationship resembles that of a priest and a parishioner. And, the San Pedro is the Eucharist. And so, that's kind of been the big question. In these rituals, is there any remnant of pre-conquest ideas about San Pedro? And, I'm inclined to think there's not a whole lot. I'll talk about that in my talk. But what we can, really learn about pre-conquest use of San Pedro is by looking at the archaeological record, by looking at these symbols that were carved into stone and, sort of very deep cosmological underpinnings to these early societies. And I believe that can tell us more about the nature of San Pedro than modern North Coastal ceremonies can.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Huh.
and in a way, that's a huge opportunity too, that
Right.
we're not hemmed in by some, sort of ancient tradition.
Yeah.
So people who work with the plant now are learning in many times directly from the plant, are self-taught or, are developing a very personal relationship with the plant rather than just sort of learning the teachings of a master, which is what happens in North Coastal Peru.
Yeah, very interesting. That sounds the way it's going to have to happen. It's I don't know if you ever read Ralph Metzner's book on the mushrooms, Teonanacatl. He points out that the traditions are broken there. The links to the traditions are largely broken for us moderns with that medicine as well. So what Ralph talks about in that book is creating hybrid ceremonies where we respectfully, hopefully humbly, hopefully with patience and diligence, learn from and incorporate various kinds of ritual practices that we've learned from our other experiences to create a new version of what he called, again, hybrid rituals.
Absolutely, I love that. I think that's what we're going to see happening.
Yeah.
One thing
with
I'd like
San
to
Pedro
just
as well.
add into that is just the importance of the ritual and the ceremony. And I love the idea of the hybrid because just as a North American culture, we've lost so much in terms of ceremony and ritual and culture. Even as young people growing up, there's no rite of passage and things like that have all been lost. So when doing this work, regardless of the medicine, it's honoring it in that spirit that it has and that it incorporates, and then to be guided with someone who knows and understands what that's all about versus like you're talking about a psychiatrist office or some sort of traditional therapy. It's not going to have that same communal and energetic and spiritual effect when you make it clinical. So the importance of we talk about this all the time, set and setting is always so important in doing any medicine work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, precisely. And I would in these hybrid ceremonies, I would really love to see a lot of underpinnings from Quechua, Native Andean land honoring practices. It's really this incredible culture that has somehow survived until today. Throughout the Andes, where people exist in this reciprocal exchange with the land. So, before you plant a field, you make an offering to the earth, give something to the earth, and then later the earth gives something to you. People carry coca leaves, the divine leaf of immortality, probably the most sacred medicine in the Central Andes. And exchange 3 leaves in gratitude and with well wishes to anybody they pass on a trail. And it's really just this the foundations of this culture are incredibly beautiful, and I believe something that we can really learn from and incorporate in any kind of rituals that we begin to create.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's actually central to the consciousness transformation revolution that we need on this planet now, is to, reconnect to our reciprocal relationship with everything, and even economically, we've gotten so far, off into this, sort of every person for themselves and accumulate and hoard and all that. And these cultures oftentimes have, that they praise generosity above all other values, and they, idealistically, from my point of view, steeped in this modern culture, it seems to me this is a much more relaxing way to live your life if everyone around you is being generous and not trying to hoard things. But also, I wanted to, get into asking you about what you're doing. Like, okay, so two-part question, I guess. How do you see your role in communicating this kind of information and developing understanding for and even perhaps protocol and guidance for working with San Pedro? And also, how does that dovetail into what you're doing in your doctoral program?
Absolutely, yeah. So what is my role and how does that fit into my doctoral program? Honestly, I'm finding my role right now to be that of, sort of a stagehand. For example, with this San Pedro sustainability, conference and initiative that we're talking about, I had this idea. I mentioned it to these people in Ecuador, and there's already this whole community sort of forming around it who's excited about it. What I really see that we need right now, in terms of psychological studies of Peru, we need an academic voice that can, at the very least, establish a baseline of work that further research with San Pedro, further academic research with San Pedro can sit upon. And so, we really, since we have no, academic voice in psychology that has said a word about San Pedro, really, we, to start with this sort of naturalistic, holistic study is really where we need to go. And so that's what I'm focused on. And I feel very, I'm an academic and we're talking about the plant spirit here. So really where that's stemming from is that I am coming to this psychology work with San Pedro through the viewpoint of phenomenology, which is this wonderful field in psychology in which you actually get to look at what people experience rather than at our concepts about what they experience.
That's
So,
phenomenology.
Phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Yeah.
I love it.
Phenomenal phenomenology, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Right.
I love it.
Yeah.
What a great
So
word.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in sort of exploring what people experience with this plant, and I'm doing qualitative research, which is more or less going to be gathering stories from people who experience this plant, and then trying to make sense of them, trying to identify common themes in people's experiences. So instead of taking somebody's experience and saying, oh, well, that probably is indicative of this psychological concept, and they're probably projecting, this part of their psychology onto that entity that they said they saw. No, that's not what we're doing. We're sort of
Boring.
trying to make sense of these stories in the light of people's experience, which, I firmly believe is more, in many ways is more valid than any concepts we can ever make about human psychology.
Well,
Have
I love
you? Go ahead,
I love
Mark.
that approach, Laurel, only because it's in line with a project I'm beginning to work on towards the end of this conference and as we move forward. So I'd be happy to stay in contact with you in that regard, because I think it's really important for real people to tell real stories about real transformation. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with that. It's
I'm
just
so
part of what
interested
we're
to
doing
hear
in
about
building
that.
the community, because people need to know that they can talk about these things and share their experience and help other people learn, grow, and even distinguish whether the medicine is something that they're, is for them as well. But it's also to take away the stigma that comes with, especially within the North American culture.
Yeah, and I find that I think you're absolutely right, and also I feel like stories are something that reach everybody. It's the ultimate bottom up kind of thing. When people are sharing their stories and their experiences and they're being heard, that dismantles, sort of the hierarchy that has, we're sometimes so often attempted to put on these plant medicines. So I'm very curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, that sounds really like a wonderful thing to be doing, gathering stories, not only useful but fun in a sense. But what about your own experience with it that way? Like, would you say that you have had what you might call contact with a spirit of the plant or spirits of the plant, or just spirits coming in through the plant altogether?
Yeah, so I personally, I experience San Pedro in a similar way to how many people have described experiencing it, which is that, they say that San Pedro lasts, the trip is 12 hours. It lasts your whole life. I mean, it's, you can't tell people that before they take San Pedro. Like, how long is it? Oh, years. But
That's good.
so many people continue to feel the plant as a spiritual entity that stays with them over days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And so that's certainly my experience.
Yeah.
What I personally feel, but it's not sort of what my own experience, is as relevant maybe as other people's experiences, but I'm more interested in their experiences, honestly. My journey with San Pedro has been one of deepening into freedom, integrity, and love. And I think those are the three really sort of defining characteristics that I feel the plant brings me on a daily basis.
That's wonderful. Freedom, integrity, and love. Wonderful. Yeah. So what was I going to ask you? Something about, oh, never mind. I lost it while you were talking. You got any more questions, Mark?
Oh, geez, where do I begin? Nothing overly specific. I'm just always, fascinated, especially within the culture. And part of me, like, to kind of kick it back to what we were talking about maybe 10 minutes ago. And, we're talking about the Western world and consumerism and consumption and losing touch with, the earth and the planet. And the one thing I just love about the indigenous people from all over the world is their respect and how they completely honor the land and how they can recognize and read it in ways that, we've just so lost connection with, like just navigating with the stars and knowing what's happening with the oceans and the mountains and the winds and things. It's just, it's a beautiful way of living in my perception. Not that I've lived that way, but to be that connected and that free and that in touch, and there's a disconnect within these cities and these concrete jungles where you can barely, you go for a barefoot hike in Vancouver, at least we got lots of great parks, but there's still lots of concrete up there.
Yeah,
and mushrooms.
It's a little tough to, I think we sort of have a tendency to idealize Indigenous cultures sometimes, which, they really do bring an incredible understanding of how we are connected to our environments. But, Wade Davis is one voice who's sort of emphasizes this idea that, there can be no conscious concept of land stewardship, for land that a culture lacks the technical capacity to destroy. So, in the Andes, for example, they're using every little piece of the land, right up to the edges of glaciers, is, grazed, and many of the wild animals like the vicuña and the spectacled bears and things like that, are nearly extinct because they've been, hunted so much. So it's sort of tricky to say, oh yeah, everything, they're doing here is good, because it's, they're humans, and they're affected by greed and things like that, just like the rest of us. But I think the difference definitely lies in sort of the yeah, like you were saying, the intentional realization of ourselves as connected, as fundamentally part of the environment. So I really appreciate,
Yeah.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so regardless of, who's doing that well and who's not, that's kind of where things need to go for the survival of the species and the planet altogether, right? And I remembered the question that I wanted to ask you a few moments ago. I don't know if you've even thought about this, but it occurred to me when you were talking about a long-term relationship with the plant, with the San Pedro, and what might be called the spirit of San Pedro. There are some traditions, and for example, some of the people in the Native American church with the peyote feel that people that are pursuing work with these plants should work with one and not a whole bunch of them like many of us do. Because of the sort of subtlety, in a sense, and power and intimacy of that developing relationship. I don't know, have you thought about that at all? About, people working with multiple medicines, like doing some ayahuasca, some psilocybin, San Pedro, MDMA, cannabis, LSD, whatever, as opposed to, say, really committing oneself and devoting oneself to working with one plant that way. What do you think? Have you thought about that at all?
A little bit, yeah. I guess, my initial response to that is that if somebody is working deeply enough with one plant or one medicine to, say that they have a relationship with that plant and that they're, on a journey with that plant, then I would say it's likely that they will be able to know for themselves whether it's right or not to be taking other medicines at the same time. I personally think that we really project our own ideas about jealousy and rivalry and competition between plants on the plants, and
I do too. Yeah.
there could be different reasons for that.
Yeah.
But I don't, I don't think there's anything wrong with working with multiple medicines unless you're working so deeply with one medicine that you really feel and have a sense that is your exclusive path.
Yeah,
So
there's
that's what I'd
probably
say.
room for both directions, and as we go forward here. Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to interject is, how do you know which is your plant teacher, your plant ally that you want to go deep with without experiencing the other medicines? I might experience ayahuasca and say, no way, that's not for me. And then experience San Pedro and go, oh my God, I need to work with this medicine. Or,
Yeah.
work with that and say, no, it's not for me. And then, the mushroom is, so how do you know until you know? And knowing is from experience.
Yeah, often it is. Although it doesn't apply to bank robbing, though.
No.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of like choosing you're choosing a partner, and you don't just. I think Dale Pendell quoted Keeper Trout saying this. You like walk into a crowd and just grab one random person and say, this is my mate. This is my. It's like a conscious thing where you're working with different medicines and you start to feel yourself gravitating towards one. For me, it was an aha moment. It was like, wow, this is different from anything I've ever experienced, and this is where I'm. It wasn't. There was not even a doubt. This is where I'm headed.
Interesting. Yeah, that's almost a kind of a destiny. So had you experienced either ritually, ceremonial, therapeutically, or just so-called recreationally, other psychedelic medicines prior to that first connection to San Pedro?
Yeah, I guess I'd mainly worked with mushrooms before working with San Pedro.
Oh yeah.
And they're an incredible, beautiful, wild medicine.
How would you describe that one? as different from San Pedro?
Oh gosh. I've, I've find that mushrooms are very, they sort of make everything into one. There's this incredible sense of oneness, and with San Pedro, you feel that oneness in that what you're made of is the same, matter that everything else is made of. But, you'll, it's sort of felt more as, working, oh gosh, how do I say this? San Pedro seems to guide people more towards working with symbology, working with, maybe the snake, the serpent as a symbol of fear, the eagle maybe as a symbol of transcendence. So you're sort of guided to break up the world into symbols that you can then use to work on your inner life. So, and San Pedro also is a little more, seems to be a little more inclined to ritual, because that's how it's been used. Whereas mushrooms, I feel, are, much more sort of free form and wild, and not as set in ritual.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. So, is there anything, people are going to watch this, hopefully, and is there anything that we haven't asked you that you think is important that you would like people to know about before we finish up here?
I don't think so too much, other than just, and I'm going to talk about this in my talk, but I really see San Pedro as this wonderful allegory for understanding how plant medicines can sit at the center of many fields, and bridge science and spirituality, and bridge indigenous and modern, and past and present and future. And so I'll really be sort of sharing the story of San Pedro through that lens, as an allegory for our understanding about how plant medicines can be valuable to us, as bridgers of gaps.
Beautiful.
Bridgers of duality.
So that talk, by the way, in case anyone didn't get it at the beginning, or maybe we didn't even mention it, maybe do you want to talk about the upcoming talk, Mark?
Well, I was saving it till the end, the big surprise. No. The talk Laurel's referring to, for anybody watching, is a pre-conference lecture, I guess we would call it, with herself and the legendary Wade Davis, and it's Opening the Gates of Heaven. So Laurel's going to be speaking more about her story, her insights, and sharing her knowledge with a group of people out at UBC. And is it the Lew Center? Is it Louis Center? How do we say that?
The Lew Institute, yeah.
Okay, so it's
yeah,
the
so
Lew
it's
Institute
kind of on
UBC.
the southwest corner of campus.
Yeah.
LIU, right? LIU? Yeah.
Now, for those of you interested, I did post a link in the comments of this video interview as well. So if you're interested, you can find it there. You can also find it on the Spirit Plant Medicine website as well. So, come on down. It's only $10, free for students. Really important. It's free for students. For anybody who wants to come down and hear what Wade and Laurel have to say in person.
It's next Tuesday, the 16th at 7 p.m., correct? Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, Laurel, on this Tuesday morning. Much appreciated. Stephen, always a pleasure. If there's any last words anybody would like to say before we sign off, thank you very much for joining us. Always honored to be able to share your experience.
Yeah, I would just like to say, I want to say thank you to you, and it's wonderful work you're doing, and it seems like it has a great future ahead of it. So, hopefully we'll be working together in various ways as we move along.
I hope so. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
See you next Tuesday.
We'll see you.
Bye.